Welcome back, Ole Miss fans, to another episode of the Rebel Talk. Today, we are joined by the co-host of the Rufino and Joe Show, Joe DeLeone, also does some Notre Dame work with Bleacher Report. We're really excited to have Joe on the show. Today, we're going to get into a lot of the NFL guys that Ole Miss has had declare for the draft, whether it's Jackson Dart, Trey Harris, Jared Ivey, Walter Nolan. We have all those players and more. So without further ado, Joe, I'm curious. I just want to introduce you a little bit to the fans here. What's it like, having to evaluate essentially almost every player who declares for the NFL draft in your work?
Yeah, it's a really painstaking process because there's so many guys that are on the radar of the NFL, and it's one that you trying to start October, November, try to get a little bit of a head start, but to do diligent work and to be able to like really dig deep into the film and understand the traits and the potential for some of these guys, it can be a very long process. I'm kind of pushing my way through and watched a lot of these Ole Miss guys recently because most of them are on the top of the radar for this upcoming class in a year where there's not really a ton of premier talent. It's one of the weaker
Right.
classes we've had in the last 5 seasons. So the potential of guys like Walter Nolan, Princely Umanmielen, even a guy like Jackson Dart are certainly in the eyes of scouts and talent evaluators. They're strong options for anywhere on day one or day two of the 2025 draft.
Yes, sir, Joe. So you just mentioned it. I want to start with Ole Miss quarterback Jackson Dart. The rumors are said, this is a weaker quarterback class, which, is very true. You got guys like Cam Ward, Shooter Sanders. I believe Quinn Ewers declared this morning.
Yep.
But Dart, he could be argued right up there with essentially any of them with the production that he had this year. I want to start, Joe. Is it known, and how much does it impact the draft stock of a player like Jackson Dart with his off the field tangibles? Because for Ole Miss fans, Jackson's known as a guy who was an incredible leader, and he's
Mm.
probably going to do really well in these interviews coming up before the draft.
So first of all, I'm really high on Jackson Dart, and I think that you just led with the first and most important part. He is, you can tell that he's a good leader on the field, and all the other things you hear off it, it seems like nothing but positives. He checks every single box there. This quarterback class, as you mentioned, it's really bad. I'm not even going to say it's weak. It's bad. It's two guys and then a ton of question marks. Jalen Milrow's got a lot of potential, and I think
Yeah.
he's probably going to be that third quarterback. But man, you enter into this crop of players that have the tools that you look for, but haven't really actualized it. Quinn Ewers is exactly that. I think that once this process like really starts to kick up steam, and with the All-Star events and the NFL Combine, and once he gets to go into these interviews, that he is going to shoot up boards. He does everything that you need. He can throw off platform. He is a great athlete. He can be impactful as a runner. He's pretty accurate as well, and he's also a strong decision maker. I think a lot of folks and just general college football fans are so quick to say, oh, he stinks. Look at the games that he had against Florida and the late interceptions that he threw. He still makes some big time throws, and he sometimes was not really set up to succeed in games because Lane Kiffin was throwing the ball too much. It was pretty obvious what Ole Miss was doing, and defenses were able to better prepare for it. He was able to elevate a lot of times this Ole Miss offense when they were a little bit shaky. They weren't able to finish drives. I think that ultimately the more opportunities that he gets throughout what is always a strong process for guys like him, that he will be a riser and could end up being that third or fourth quarterback selected.
Yeah, man. And you mentioned it, but the Ole Miss run game was essentially flat. It really had
Yeah.
really nothing going on, especially if you watch the tape. So you make a great point. And then, I'm curious in terms of ceilings and floors, where do you think Jackson Dart could fit into the NFL? Looking to not only his rookie year, but also, second, third year down the road.
I don't see a way that I don't see why he couldn't be like Bo Nix for a team if we're talking about his ceiling. And there are some comparable traits there and early impacts and what they did in their separate careers. The experience level and their age also is very similar for how long the both of them played college football for. I think that he could be like that as a rookie for a team that's looking for an immediate answer, looking for somebody who that they can step in, trust, that is just going to bring a high floor to a roster. I don't think though that he necessarily is going to fit into that upper category of eventually being a top 10 quarterback in the NFL. It's just he's not on the same arm talent level of a
Yeah.
guy like Cam Ward. He's not the same level of decision maker and handler of pressure like Shedeur Sanders is. But for him to be middle of the pack, and if he does get an opportunity to start and he does go in the first round, it's very realistic for him to play in the Derek Carr, the Andy Dalton, the Bo Nix type of a mold of a quarterback that does enough to boost the quality of the production and kind of levels things out instead of really taking them over the top like those premier guys like Joe Burrow and Patrick Mahomes and such that Shedeur Sanders and Cam Ward are going to more so project like.
Absolutely, Joe. And I want to take this, into Jackson Dart's primary receiver over the past couple of years, looking at Trey Harris. Again, a lot of mixed opinions on Trey. You have guys who think his college ability isn't going to translate into the NFL, and then there are guys who think, oh, he's 6'3", he's getting over 5.3 yards per catch. This is your receiver. Where do you sit with Trey?
Trey Harris is probably the most difficult receiver to evaluate in this class because early season production was nuts. He was so productive at the beginning of the year that he still finished as a 1,000-yard receiver. But the tape that he has in those games, it's against weak opponents. So how much can you really evaluate that and understand what the projection is? I tried to watch the LSU game, and you could tell that he was not moving at the same level. The whole second half of the year, it was hard to watch his film because you could see that he was hampered. That's why he's really going to be hard, I think, for where he's going to fit. But with that being said, if he goes later than maybe many would hope and Ole Miss fans would like to see him go, he could be one of these guys in this class that ends up outperforming expectations because the NFL is kind of going off of the way that he played when he was banged up. I don't know what his current timetable is and his availability to test. I would hope that if he does get to test it, he would flash. Being 6'3" and over 200 pounds, I think he would run a pretty good 40 for a bigger receiver. I really like the big thing with him is he's a really good route runner. He's got really quick feet. We just got to figure out, though, is that early version of him at the beginning of the year, is that the true Trey Harris, or is that just a guy that was, a product of the opportunity to go up against relatively weaker competition?
Spot on, man. Yeah, those first 4 games, you look back and those were not strong opponents by any means. But, I'm curious myself. Trey Harris is a guy who got hurt last year, ended up missing a couple games with a knee injury. Then he suffers another lower body injury that, silenced him for almost half the year here, Joe. How important is that for NFL guys when they're evaluating these receivers?
I think it's always an important part of the evaluation process for looking at guys that have multiple injuries because sadly, when guys start to get banged up in college, that's very rarely goes away. Certain guys' bodies just can't take the contact. And a lot of times when you're dealing with various injuries, especially to your lower body, they start to accumulate. They start to build up. Most guys, if you talk to them that have suffered injuries from playing, especially receivers, those things are very rarely fully recovered from. It's, I think, something that's very underrated in talking about guys that are hurt is you might find new ways to perform and to play differently after your injury, but there's always going to be some slight detraction from what you had when you were once fully healthy. I think it's definitely going to get brought up. I think to his benefit, though, this receiver class isn't great. There's a lot of guys that did not perform and play to the degree that were expected to. Isaiah Bond's a perfect example, a guy who just declared. So Trey Harris is still in play to go somewhere on day 2. And maybe if he does slide because of the injury stuff, he would be one of the first receivers I would assume picked in the 4th round.
Yeah, man. And then I want to talk about another Ole Miss receiver, Juice Wells. Kind of a similar situation here. Battled an injury for essentially all of 2023. He posts a 1,000-yard receiving season at South Carolina in 2022. And then he comes to Ole Miss, and just like you said, Joe, he looks like a whole new player. He looks a little bit slower. He's not making as many catches. Some could argue that he was mismanaged in Lane Kiffin's offense. But what evaluation do you have set for Wells? Because before the season, this is a guy who's arguably being taken in the 2nd or 3rd round without even playing a snap, just based on what he did in South Carolina.
Admittedly, Juice Wells, guy that when I started watching his tape, I was expecting to be underwhelmed for what you just brought up, a limited production. You kind of wonder, like, hey, what went wrong here? He just wasn't really getting as many opportunities. It felt like a lot of plays were going away from him. I came away pleasantly surprised and pretty optimistic. I felt like he's one of these players in this class for a day 3 pick that I'm going to be pushing as an underrated prospect in the mix. I think that he could be a really high quality third receiver on a team at the very least is just really good receiver depth. Maybe somebody who could return kicks. He's got a much thicker build than you would expect for somebody who's a deep threat, being listed at over 200 pounds. I'd be curious to see what he comes in at the combine, but the strength that he has is probably what's the most underrated part. He is really hard to press. He's one of those guys that has a great release. He's got really good long speed. I think part of what played into, though, him having a weaker year this year and why his draft stock is going to be a little bit mellowed out is his hands are really inconsistent. He just does not have consistency coming down with the ball, nor does he have the length to really win in the air and to win in tight spots, in just really tight coverage against cornerbacks. That's what's going to limit him in the NFL. That's why he's probably more of a gadget guy, why he's probably more of somebody who is just used as that deep threat to take the top off of a defense to keep them honest. Maybe he goes for an occasional big gain or has a 100-yard game here or there in the NFL, but the inconsistency with his hands are definitely going to limit him.
Spot on. In juice, he was really productive when he got the ball in space. When Trey Harris went out, he was kind of forced into that deep threat role. Didn't get the ball in space as much. But again, I do think he has some tangibles that can play. A very strong guy like Joe mentioned. And then probably the last offensive guy I want to touch on is Caden Prieskorn, Joe. Again, I've talked to a lot of Ole Miss fans before the season. Similar situation. Caden's very high on these NFL draft boards. Doesn't really get targeted as much. Doesn't get as many receptions. But regardless, he has that NFL type frame. I'm curious where you see him fitting in this year's draft class.
Yeah, Prieskorn, it's hard to come by the size that he has. That is going to be his biggest driving force, being listed at 6'6", 255. The NFL can't come by guys that are that big and that can move well enough as he can. Limited athlete quite a bit. For as big as he is, you would maybe hope and expect that he'd be a mauling blocker, but at times poor angles, poor pad height, things that could improve for him. Probably not going to be a team's number one tight end. Probably not living up to what you just described there, being a day 2 pick, maybe an early day 3 pick, but he has that frame, that build that the NFL covets enough for him to stick on a roster as a second or a third tight end. Guys like him, I think, are just built perfectly to be really quality special teams players. Just everything that you need for somebody that you can put on punt coverage or to run down on kickoff. That's what's going to be his bread and butter. Not going to be a big name in this class, but just a solid prospect that's definitely worth mentioning in this tight end group that, like every single year, is usually pretty weak once we get to the back end of it.
Exactly. Yeah, Prieskorn, we talked about it, but kind of a decline this year, so it'll be interesting to see where he ends up. I want to flip over to the defensive side here, Joe. There's 3 guys who I really want to hit on, and I want to start by mentioning it's Prince Emmanuel, Walter Nolan, Trey Amos. And in this order, I want to see who you think is going to get selected first.
I think it's going to be Princely Umamiel, and the big reason why it's the upside for him. It is the ridiculous bend and the power that he's able to play with. He has so much potential, at the very least, I think, to be a really high quality situational pass rusher. There are just so few guys on this planet that play the game of football that can dip the way that he can and to move with the weight that he has. That's where all of his production came from, going up against tackles that thought that they had him, and he out leverages them, and he just knows how to use his body to his advantage. But one of the things that probably is going to hurt him, lack of an impact against the run, sometimes just an overall lack of intensity. Yeah. You would like to see him be a more impactful there. And maybe that's why he lands more as a situational pass rusher. But there's a really, really realistic chance that Umamielen ends up going in the first round in a class in this edge group where a lot of guys are going to be highly coveted. I think there's a lot of guys that have big strengths, other question marks. Teams see a player like this, and teams in the back end of the first round that have well-rounded defenses see somebody that they don't need to play every snap, somebody that they can just bring in on third downs, long passing situations. That is something that the NFL, I think, is going to be really excited about. And most importantly, he's going to test probably really, really well at the NFL Combine.
Oh, I bet. Yeah. Princely's an athletic freak in terms of size. Yeah. And then you look at the way he moves on the field. I'm going to put you on the spot here, Joe. Is there a team that comes to mind who could use a third down edge rusher like Prince Umamielen?
I think a really easy one that would make a lot of sense. The Kansas City Chiefs are always seemingly drafting pass rushers, and depending on what happens with Spagnuolo, if at the time of taping this, if he doesn't
Right.
end up taking a head coaching job, him having a diverse group of guys to deploy as pass rushers has always been something that he has focused on. So knowing that they're already a little bit more balanced along their defensive line, and they've already got veterans like Chris Jones and George Karlaftis, like knowing that they have those presences on that defensive line, I think that he could fit in nicely there. The other ones that you think of, like Baltimore Ravens, they wouldn't need to keep him out there on every single down. I would get worried about somebody like Umamielen if he had to go to a team that is a defensive mess. Thankfully for his case, the first team that like comes to mind that like really needs edge rusher help is the Panthers. I don't think the Panthers are going to be in range, and a lot of these teams that have pass rushing issues are picking in the top 15. I think that back end of the first round is going to be where he's going to succeed the most.
Absolutely. And then those two other guys between Walter Nolan and Trey Amos, who do you got going next?
I think it could go in any order. I think that Walter Nolan, his just physical profile, and he's probably another player who's going to test really well at the NFL Combine. I also think, though, that throughout this process, Walter Nolan might end up hurting himself just because the more that people get exposed to his film, the more that you start to see that there is inconsistent effort at times when he plays. I know that that has been a qualm for Texas A&M fans. It has been a qualm for Ole Miss fans. I'm hoping that he figures it out because he could be really, really dominant if he gave the same effort on every single play. But you just see this crazy power. You just see this ability to completely overwhelm and get under offensive linemen for a guy that is big as he is. If he was able to do that, I think he would be one of the best run defenders in the NFL. Realistically, with those general concerns, probably going to be more of a third round pick, maybe a second round pick. Trey Amos is an interesting player though, because he's got pretty good production. He's somebody that I think is getting lauded often by in this corner class. The problem for him is that this is a really deep corner class. I think that knowing all of the rare athletes that are in the mix, it's probably going to push him down to end up being a fourth round pick, maybe a late third round pick. He's tall, he's long, he's able to dominate at the catch point because he has that length and he's got pretty good feet and pretty good long speed. The only thing that comes into play with him, not super strong. And the other thing as well is that his hip fluidity is not as great. So he's probably going to be a bit more of a scheme specific guy that's going to play mostly zone. He's going to be somebody that's going to be, I think a lot of defensive coordinators, they're going to be reluctant to deploy in press situations. But is just a quality player that put up really good production this season. They'll be worthy of taking somewhere in the fourth round.
Absolutely. And I want to hit on Walter Nolan for a second. I'm not sure if you saw the show, but I believe he compared himself to potentially being the next Aaron Donald of the NFL. Are there any comparisons there, or is that a crazy statement from Nolan?
When did he say that? I'm just curious. Was that recent? Because that is kind of crazy. I don't see any. I mean, he's taller and bigger than him, so I don't really see that. Was that recent though?
One day ago, next Aaron Donald, he deemed himself.
Oh my God. Yeah, no, I don't see that. Aaron Donald was getting underneath dudes and his hand usage was elite. Like it was unbelievable. And he showed that at the Senior Bowl. Walter Nolan, I don't really get that same level of technique. He's not there yet. If he thinks he could get there, yeah, sure. He could totally have that same level of impact. Maybe that's what he's projecting and hoping for, that he can be that impactful. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I guess I'm glad that he's got high aspirations for himself, that's what he's working towards.
No, and another thing that doesn't really make sense. Again, I'm a huge Walter Nolan guy. He did incredible things at Ole Miss, but
yeah,
like they're not even remotely similar in terms of size.
Yeah, more profile.
But yeah, he's got aspirations. I think that's great. And then Trey Amos here. You know what? I'm kind of curious, just as an Ole Miss guy, do Pete Golding cornerbacks have a certain reputation, Joe? And because Trey, he went from Alabama to Ole Miss this year, excuse me, and kind of turned himself into this appealing NFL prospect. Is that under Pete Golding's system, or is that just kind of a natural developmental thing for a guy who's 6'1" and very athletic?
I think that ultimately Pete Golding defensive backs, any defensive back that's played under Nick Saban, and also defensive backs that have played for Kirby Smart, they're always going to get that extra benefit of the doubt because they have the instincts. That's where Trey Amos, where his hips are not as flexible and fluid as the guys that are going to go before him. But you can see just really good instincts when the ball's in the air and knowing how to use his arms and his really, really long arms and his height to make plays on the football. I kind of think of what might be his projection here. Kamari Lassiter last year, who
Sure.
there's some similarities physically. We saw the impact that he had for the Texans' win over the Chargers in the wild card game with the interception that he had, and he had a pretty good rookie year. He didn't test well. He didn't have a very good testing day at all. His 40 time was poor. He had a really good short shuttle time, which I think Trey Amos could have similar type of testing numbers. And he looked, just a little bit concerning on how fluid he was going to be in moving to the NFL. But the Texans took him knowing you're getting a really smart, high quality player that was seeing a lot of challenges in the SEC. I think the same thing applies here for Amos. Yeah. Being a part of that just same general indirect Alabama tree, because Pete Golding came from Alabama, Kirby comes from Alabama, all that stuff. Being a part of that same tree and knowing that he's going to be ready to play right away will be valuable to a team that is looking for less of a long-term projection and looking for somebody that's high floor that will at the very least be a really good third corner or fourth corner on their roster.
Yeah, man. No, that's great insight, and I'm sure Ole Miss fans are happy listening to that because Pete Golding, he does incredible things for this football program, especially in terms of recruiting. And one of those guys he recruited out of the transfer portal last year, Chris Paul, Joe, another interesting one because Ole Miss fans didn't know if he was coming back, going to the NFL. He finally declares, and in a way, he reminds me of Jackson Dart because all the intangibles in terms of leadership on playing every snap like his life depends on it are there. But I want to hear from a guy like you. What do you see from his on-field production?
Yeah, he is somebody who just flies all over the field. Not super big, not your
Yes.
prototypical big meathead middle linebacker who's running downhill and knocking dudes over. He is winning with finesse. He is winning with nuance. He is a lot quicker and lower to the ground than most linemen, so he's able to navigate traffic that way. I think that there is a good, strong chance that he's one of the first linebackers selected this year. Not a first rounder, but naturally linebackers tend to slide in a lot of draft classes. Him going somewhere in the third round is where I have him projected. Maybe he goes a little bit later, depending on how he measures, because his arm length's probably not going to be great. He might end up being much smaller than the 6'1" number that he was listed at. But I think he's going to test great. I think he's going to run really well. You see that on film. The instincts, and then you mentioned the relentlessness, the intensity that he plays with is something that you can't find often in college linebackers. You can't find these guys that go 100 miles an hour and are just making decisions so quickly. I think that definitely translates, and he could be a really good will linebacker at the next level for all of those reasons.
Yeah, man. And then the final guy I want to touch on here, Jared Ivey. Look, Joe, Jared, he played in the defensive line, which led the country in sacks. Does that play an impact into how guys are evaluating him, knowing that he's playing in a group filled with Walter Nolan, JJ McGee's, Princey Mamiel, and all these NFL guys as well?
No, I think that if anything, it definitely helps his case that again he's coming from a situation where it's NFL-esque. He knows how to play his role, and he's not going to be on the field every single down. I think that Jared Ivey, out of all these guys, if he has the longest NFL career, I wouldn't be shocked. I think one thing that's really interesting with him, I feel like he was misdeployed at Ole Miss. They were asking him to play wide alignments as a defensive end. I think for his 6'6", 280-pound build, that he should transition to a 3-4 defensive end, play a little bit more inside, maybe be a sub-package rush defensive tackle, just because he doesn't have that general – we're talking a lot about flexibility today. He doesn't really have that flexibility that you look for in an edge rusher, but you've got a dude that's just super physical, that is super strong. He's always making plays at the line of scrimmage. He's always grabbing onto guys. I think that if he wasn't so far out in such a wide alignment playing on this Ole Miss defense like they needed him to, and he was playing more in the interior, he'd be making more plays at the line of scrimmage and he'd have more tackles for loss, or just at the very least would be eating up a lot more blocks. So I'm a big Jared Ivey fan. Fourth round grade for him. right now, and if he ends up going a little bit later than that and goes on to just have a really solid NFL career, I think that it is all in the works for that to come to fruition.
Yeah, and Ivy's another guy, similar to a lot of the players entering the NFL draft. Off the field, seems like a great dude. He's probably going to kill these interviews. So that's a great to hear actually about Ivy. I'm sure fans are going to be relatively surprised about that one. Then the last question I got for you, Joe, before we head out of here, out of all of these Ole Miss players, who is going to be the most successful in the NFL?
That is an awesome question because there's just so many different potential outcomes, and I'm going to go with two guys, one on offense and on defense. To reiterate what I just said about Jared Ivey, I think that if we're illustrating success based on career length
Yeah,
and how long he sticks in the NFL and playing to his role, I think that Jared Ivey can be that guy to have that success. On offense, I really think, and I have a lot of faith that Jackson Dart can be a quality starting quarterback in the NFL. So I think that there is a ton of potential for him if he ends up in the right situation, if he's not thrust onto a bad roster that has no receivers and he's expected to do everything. Instead, if he is given the Bo Nix blueprint of being on a team with a good offensive line and a really good defense, I don't know exactly what team that is. Maybe it's the Saints. That's the circumstance that he lands in. I think that he could be a really nice starting quarterback in the NFL.
Jackson Dart and Jared Ivey, Joe DeLeone. You heard it here first, folks. Let's hold them accountable to it. Joe, where can we find you on social media, brother?
Yeah, you can catch me on Twitter at Joe DeLeone. And then you mentioned earlier, check out my podcast, Rufino and Joe Show, breaking down college football every Monday, Wednesday, and Sunday at 7 p.m. Eastern time. Zach, appreciate it a ton, and I'm sure we're going to catch up soon.
Yeah, man. We'll get you guys some more NFL draft content as we get closer. Huge shout out to Joe DeLeone. Go follow him like he just said. Be sure to like and subscribe. Leave a comment. Go Rebs and hotty toddy. Thanks, guys.